The dampness of that cellar in Limoges wasn't something you merely felt. It was a living thing that crawled into your lungs and settled there, heavy and suffocating. Even now, decades later, when the rain lashes against the window of my study, I can taste the mold. It tasted like old pennies and stale wine, a flavor that coated the back of my throat and refused to be washed away by the acorn sludge we pretended was coffee. I sit here in my armchair, surrounded by the dry, comforting scent of paper and mahogany, but if I close my eyes, the years dissolve. I am back in the dark. I am 23 years old, and I am terrified. They tell you that memory is a recording device, a faithful scribe of history. That is a lie. Memory is a painter, and a dishonest one at that. It adds color where there was only gray. It softens the edges of the jagged terror until it becomes something noble, something heroic. But I must try to strip away the varnish. I must try to remember the boy I was, before I became the lie. I was huddled under a woolen blanket that smelled of wet dog, shivering not from the cold, though it was bone deep, but from a corrosive anxiety that ate at my stomach lining. In my hands, I held a shard of mirror I had scavenged from a bombed-out milliner's shop. I tilted it toward the flickering tallow candle, the only light in my subterranean universe. The face that stared back was a stranger's. The eyes were too wide, rimmed with red exhaustion, darting with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. The cheeks were hollowed out, the skin gray and papery. This was not Peter Thompson, the student of philosophy who spent his afternoons debating the ethics of Kant in the warm, dust-mote-filled air of the university library. This was Jane Luke, a farm laborer from St. Junien with a limp and a fabricated history folded neatly in his breast pocket. I stared at the reflection, desperate to find a trace of Peter. I tried to summon the sensory details of my life in London, using the rigorous mental discipline I had honed in lecture halls. I tried to recall the smell of the beeswax polish on the library tables, the hushed rustle of turning pages, the golden quality of the light as it filtered through the high windows in the late afternoon. I tried to conjure the taste of Earl Grey tea, the way the bergamot steam would rise and fog my spectacles. But the memories were slippery. They were fading photographs left too long in the sun. The library was just a vague concept of safety. The tea was a phantom flavor I couldn't place. Instead, my mind was filled with the immediate, visceral reality of the occupation. The crunch of jackboots on cobblestones, the metallic tang of fear, the oppressive weight of a city holding its breath. I felt a surge of panic, a true metaphysical horror. If I played the role of Jean Luc long enough, would Peter Thompson cease to exist? Was I eroding? I looked down at my hands. They were stained with grime and ink, the fingernails jagged. These were not the hands that turned the delicate pages of Spinoza. These were hands that wired explosives and forged ration cards. The dissociation was dizzying. I felt a desperate, childish urge to run, to claw my way out of the cellar and scream my real name to the heavens, just to hear it spoken aloud. I wanted to retreat. I wanted to go back to the ordinary world where the only battles were rhetorical and the only danger was a failing grade. I wanted to refuse this call that had led me into the bowels of the earth. My reverie was shattered by the equipment in the corner. The wireless set, a bulky suitcase of valves and wires that looked like a coffin for a ventriloquist's dummy, began to hum. It wasn't a noise so much as a change in air pressure, a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then came the sound, a rhythmic, high-pitched scratching against the silence. Morse. I scrambled over to the set, the blanket falling from my shoulders. My hand, trembling a moment ago, became steady as I reached for the pencil. The training took over. The intellectual part of me, the part that loved patterns and languages, surged to the forefront. ... The stream of nonsense letters flowed onto the pad. To anyone else it was gibberish. To me it was poetry. It was the voice of London, crossing the channel, crossing the occupied zones, finding me in my hole. I deciphered the groups of letters using the silk one-time pad hidden in the lining of my coat. The message revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. It was not a philosophical treatise. It was an execution order. the sabotage operation against the rail lines and the telephone exchanges. It was tonight. I stared at the paper. The words seemed to vibrate. This was it. The waiting was over. The anxiety of the abstract was about to be replaced by the terror of the concrete. I held the piece of paper over the candle flame. The fire caught the edge, curling the paper into black ash that floated up toward the damp ceiling. I watched the words burn, the order, the code, the connection to my old life, until the flame licked my fingertips. I didn't flinch. The pain was grounding. It burned away the student. It burned away Peter. There was only Jean-Luc now, and he had work to do. I climbed the narrow, rotting stairs that led up to the street, counting the steps in the dark. 1, 2, 3, just as I had practiced. 11 steps to the heavy oak door. I paused with my hand on the iron latch, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was the threshold. On this side, the damp safety of the tomb. On the other, the occupied city of Limoges. A place where a wrong glance or a misplaced vowel meant death. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. The sensory shift was violent. The cellar had been a place of muffled, wet silence. The city was a cacophony of hard edges. The air was sharp and cold, biting at my exposed face. It smelled of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and the distinct, acrid exhaust of diesel engines, the scent of the German war machine. The darkness wasn't total. It was punctured by the sweeping beams of searchlights that cut through the low clouds like scalpels, and the dim, blue-tinted glow of the blackout lamps. I began to walk. My gait changed. I adopted the slight, favoring limp of Jean-Luc, the farm laborer with the bad knee. It wasn't just acting. It was a physical restructuring of my center of gravity. I kept my head down, shoulders hunched, making myself smaller. Greya, the instructors at Wamborough Manor, had drilled into us. Their voices were my mentors now. I didn't have a professor to guide me through this thesis. I had the gruff, terrifying whisper of the sergeant major in my ear. I glanced sideways into the reflection of a darkened bakery window. Behind me, the street was empty, save for a stray cat picking through a rubbish bin. I turned the corner onto the Rue Jean Jaurès, and my stomach dropped. A checkpoint. It hadn't been there yesterday. A temporary barrier of wooden sawhorses and barbed wire blocked the road. 2 soldiers stood under the harsh glare of a street lamp, their silhouettes sharp and angular. Their steel helmets gleamed with a dull, malevolent sheen. One of them had a submachine gun slung across his chest, his thumb resting casually near the trigger guard. There was no turning back. To turn around was to admit guilt. I had to go forward. I had to cross the threshold. As I approached, the world narrowed down to the crunch of my boots on the frost-slicked pavement. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to fight, to do anything but walk calmly toward the men who wanted to kill me. But I was a student of the mind. I forced myself to analyze the scene, to break it down into data points. The soldier on the left was young, perhaps 19. His uniform was slightly too large. The one on the right was older, a corporal with the bored, dangerous look of a man who had seen too much. "Halt," the corporal barked. The word was a slap. I stopped, letting my shoulders slump further, assuming the posture of a tired, harmless peasant. I fumbled in my pocket for my papers, making sure my hands shook just enough to appear natural, but not enough to seem guilty. "Papiers," he demanded, switching to a clumsy, guttural French. I handed over the forged identity card. The texture of the paper felt rough against my thumb. It was a masterpiece of forgery, created by a jeweler in London, but in the glare of the flashlight, it looked impossibly fake to me. I waited for him to spot the flaw, to see that the ink was too fresh or the stamp too perfect. The corporal shone the light in my face. I blinked, blinded. "Woher kommst du?" he asked suddenly, switching back to German. It was a trap, a test of reflex. If I answered in German, I was done. If I looked confused, I might survive. But Jean-Luc wouldn't understand. Or would he? No, Jean-Luc was a simple man. I stared at him, letting my mouth hang open slightly. Je ne comprends pas. Saint Junien. Je vis au travail. The corporal stared at me for a second that stretched into an eternity. I could smell him, tobacco, leather, and a faint hint of peppermint. I watched his eyes scan my face, looking for the tell, the micro-expression of intelligence that would give me away. I flattened my mind. I thought of nothing. I was a stone. I was a turnip. He grunted and shoved the papers back at me. Weg, he muttered, waving his hand. I took the papers, nodded subserviently, and shuffled past them. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I waited until I was 3 blocks away before I allowed myself to exhale. The breath shuddered out of me, white in the cold air. I had passed. I had spoken to the dragon and lived. But the relief was short-lived. A block later, the night was torn apart not by a siren, but by a sound more final. A shout, a scuffle of boots, and then the sickening, dry crack of a pistol shot. Not a bang, but a hard, flat slap against the stone walls. I froze in the shadows of a doorway. Across the street, 2 Feldgendarmes were standing over a dark shape on the pavement. One of them holstered his weapon, adjusting his belt with a casual indifference that chilled my blood more than the violence itself. They didn't check for a pulse. They just lit cigarettes and walked away, leaving the bundle of rags and flesh where it lay. I forced myself to look. It was an old man. He had been carrying a loaf of bread. It lay in the gutter, soaking up the black fluid spreading from his head. This wasn't the war of maps and strategies I had studied. This was the reality. Arbitrary, brutal, without meaning. My idealism, the high-minded outrage that had driven me to join the SOE, felt suddenly thin and brittle, like glass ready to shatter. I moved on. Faster now. The city felt like a labyrinth of bones. I needed to find the contact. I needed to find the network. I reached the rendezvous point, a nondescript cafe near the station that had officially closed hours ago. I knocked the rhythm, minus the 2 bits. The door opened a crack, revealing a slice of yellow light and a suspicious eye. The wind blows from the east, I whispered. But the apples are ripe in the west, the voice replied. The door opened. I stepped inside, the warmth of the room washing over me, smelling of sawdust and roasted onions. The contrast to the cold street was dizzying. At the back of the room, sitting at a small round table, was the man I had come to meet. He stood up as I approached. He was older than I expected, with a shock of silver hair and a face etched with the lines of a charismatic leader. He wore a rough tweed jacket, but he wore it with the elegance of a diplomat. This was the baker, the head of the local resistance circuit. "Welcome, my friend," he said, his voice warm and resonant, extending a hand. "We have been waiting for you. You must be frozen." I shook his hand. It was dry and strong. He smiled, a genuine, reassuring smile that made me want to collapse into a chair and weep with relief. Here, finally, was an ally. Here was the strength I needed. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the chair. "Wine," he reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver cigarette case. He snapped it open and offered me one. I declined. He took one for himself, tapping it on the case before placing it between his lips. He struck a match, the flame illuminating his face, casting deep shadows in his eye sockets. I watched the smoke curl up from the tip of the cigarette. It was blue and aromatic, a rich, smooth scent that cut through the smell of the onions. It wasn't the harsh, black tobacco the locals rolled in newspaper. It wasn't the acrid French. My eyes locked onto the small gold lettering on the white paper of the cigarette as he inhaled. It was a German brand. A luxury brand, the kind favored by officers, the kind you couldn't buy in Limoges, not unless you had friends in the commandanter. The baker smiled at me through the haze of smoke, his eyes twinkling with warmth. But the warmth didn't reach me. The room suddenly felt colder than the cellar. I looked at the man who was supposed to be my savior, and I saw the enemy sitting across the table, wreathed in the smoke of treason. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat, forcing it down with a sip of wine that suddenly tasted of vinegar and ash. I forced the muscles in my face to hold the smile, a porcelain mask that felt like it would crack at any moment. I listened to him talk about liberty, about the sanctity of France, while the smoke from his German cigarette curled around us like a poisonous snake. I played the part of the naive recruit, the idealistic student eager to serve, nodding at his lies for 20 agonizing minutes. When I finally stood to leave, he gripped my shoulder. A fatherly gesture. It made my skin crawl. I walked out into the freezing Limoges night, my knees only buckling when I turned the corner into a dark alley. I vomited into the gutter. The student in me wanted to believe it was a mistake, a stolen pack, a trophy, but the spy, the cold, calculating creature growing inside my chest, knew better. I had to be sure. For the next 3 days, I ceased to be Peter Thompson. I became a shadow stitched into the fabric of the city. I lived on rooftops and in damp cellars. I watched the baker. I saw him move with the confidence of a man who holds all the cards. I saw the subtle nods to men in gray raincoats, the exchanges of folded newspapers in crowded markets. But suspicion is not proof, and in our world, you do not accuse the later without a smoking gun. The night of the Long Knives operation was days away. Lives were on the line. I needed to trap him. I drafted a message, a fabrication of pure desperate hope, a weapons drop, urgent, tonight, at the abandoned tannery by the Vienne River. I sent it through a courier I knew he intercepted. Then I waited. I lay in the freezing mud of the riverbank for 6 hours. The cold seeped through my coat, settling into my marrow, but I couldn't shiver. Shivering makes noise. I watched the tannery through rain-slicked binoculars, my breath shallow. Midnight came and went. Then the sound. Not the low rumble of a resistance truck, but the high-pitched whine of heavy engines. Headlights cut through the mist. Trucks painted in field gray. The SS. They didn't approach with caution. They approached with ownership. They stormed the empty building, bayonets fixed, barking orders that drifted across the water. I watched them tear the floorboards up. I watched the violence of their search. The baker had not just ignored the drop. He had sold it. He had sold me. He had sold us all. The betrayal didn't break my heart. It calcified it. The fear evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity. I couldn't simply shoot him in the street. He carried the names of 20 other agents in his head. If he died, they died. I needed to extract the rot before I cut it out. I tracked him to St. Mitchell des Lions. It was Tuesday, confession day. He was a pious traitor. I watched him enter the church, a dark figure against the gray stone. I followed, slipping into the gloom of the nave. The air was thick with incense and the damp smell of old wool. Silence pressed against my ears. I saw him enter the confessional booth. I waited for the priest to step out for his break. Then I moved. I didn't walk. I glided. I slipped into the priest's booth, separated from him by a thin latticework of wood and a velvet curtain. I could hear his breathing, heavy, rhythmic. I didn't whisper. I didn't use the French of the Limousin. I summoned the voice I had practiced in front of mirrors in London. The voice of authority, the voice of the enemy. I spoke in the clipped, imperious German of an Abwehr colonel, a Berlin dialect dripping with aristocratic boredom and menace. Your performance is slipping, agent. I heard his breath hitch, a sharp intake of air. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Father, he stammered, his voice trembling. Do not play the fool, I snapped, pitching my voice lower, harsher. Berlin is losing patience. The drop at the tannery was a waste of fuel. Your intelligence is degrading. I sent them, he whispered. I did as ordered. The Englishman, he told me. The Englishman is a test, I lied, improvising on the razor's edge. And you are failing it. We believe you are holding back. We believe you are turning. No, the desperation in his voice was pathetic. No, I serve the Reich. I serve only you. Prove it, I hissed. Give me the handler's codes for the secondary network. No, or I open this door and leave you to the wolves of the resistance. He crumbled. The facade of the noble leader dissolved. He began to weep, a soft, pathetic sound. He whispered names, locations, safe houses I didn't know existed. Dead drops in bakeries and schools. He was spilling the blood of my friends to save his own miserable skin. I memorized every syllable, etching them into my mind. Suddenly, the heavy iron hinges of the church entrance groaned. A draft of cold air rushed through the nave, disturbing the candle flames. Footsteps echoed on the flagstones. Heavy boots, measured, deliberate. My heart hammered against my ribs. I gripped the Luger in my lap until my knuckles turned white. One pair of boots. Two, was it the Gestapo coming to meet their asset? Was it the priest returning? The footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped right outside the booth. The baker paused, sensing the shift in the air. The confession died in his throat. "Sir," he whispered to me, terror rising in his voice. Is that them?" I had a split second to decide. If I shot him, the gunshot would bring the intruder down on me. If I stayed silent, he might open the door. The footsteps shuffled. A hand touched the latch of my booth. The curtain ripped back. A beam of light blinded me. I raised the gun, my finger tightening on the trigger. "Peter." The voice was rough, familiar. It was Jacques, my radio man. I let out a breath I felt I had been holding for days. Behind Jacques stood three boys from the Maquis, their faces smeared with soot, their stens leveled at the darkness. "Take him," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Halut." I kicked open the partition door. The baker looked up, blinking in the flashlight beam. When he saw me, not a German colonel, but the young student he had welcomed, his face collapsed. He screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear, but of madness. The realization that he had confessed his treason to the very man he tried to kill. "Get him out," I ordered, quietly. They dragged him out into the night. I didn't watch. I sat in the booth for a moment, the smell of his fear still lingering in the air. I had won. I had saved the network. But the victory tasted like bile. We used the codes he gave us. The night of the long knives went ahead. We blew the rail lines at Limoges. We crippled the transport infrastructure for weeks. It was a masterstroke of sabotage. London was ecstatic. I received a commendation, but I couldn't celebrate. I walked into the sacristy to wash the grime from my hands. There was a small, cracked mirror above the basin. I splashed cold water on my face and looked up. The face staring back was a stranger. The soft features of the literature student were gone. The eyes were flat, hard stones, void of light. The mouth was set in a grim line that looked like it would never smile again. The innocence was cauterized, burned away by the acid of deception. I had killed the baker's cover, but I had killed Peter Thompson in that booth as well. A spy had walked out, a machine of lies and suspicion. I survived the war. I came home to London in '45. A hero with ribbons I kept in a shoebox under my bed. I tried to reclaim my life. I went back to the university. I sat in the lecture halls, smelling of chalk and old paper, listening to professors drone on about ethics, about the categorical imperative, about the noble, rational nature of man. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to stand up and scream. I wanted to overturn the heavy oak desks. They were reading from books. They were debating theories. I had read the text written in blood on a confessional floor. I had seen that there is no categorical imperative when a gun is at your head. I couldn't study anymore. The words swam on the page, meaningless hieroglyphs. I couldn't trust the syllabus. I couldn't trust the person sitting next to me. Every handshake felt like a potential betrayal. Every smile hid a wolf. I found myself analyzing the subtext of a hello, the hidden agenda of a birthday gift. I watched my own family with the eyes of an operative, looking for the tell, the lie, the German cigarette. I never graduated. The student of culture learned that culture is fragile, a thin veneer over the savagery, easily crushed by a boot or sold for a pack of luxury tobacco. The thesis is abandoned. The logic is shattered. The book is closed forever. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.